Well, good afternoon and welcome to the first in a series of hot topics organized by the Colvin Center. We've got Sir Jonathan Sanders, former CBS Moscow correspondent, and Ecaterina Miscisina, who is a Marie Colvin Fellow from Moldova, where she works with WatchDog, an organization that combats disinformation, including Russian disinformation on the war in Ukraine. And we're going to be looking at President Putin's speech from yesterday and discussing the implications. So first, Professor Sanders, Jonathan, I'm going to start with you. Can you give me the key takeaways from Putin's speech?
Yes, there are really two kinds of speeches contained in this blunderbuss of bellicosity that Putin launched. One is to a domestic audience, or chiefly news to a domestic audience. Attention, men under 60 years old who've been in the reserves, we're calling you up in a partial mobilization. How do Russians read this? Well, he called the war in Ukraine a special military action. So partial means partial, probably not the kids of the Kremlin. The second part of this was aimed specifically at the West, and that's because this Friday, in the 4 provinces that Russian troops have overrun at some point, either since 2014 or more recently, there are going to be wonderful sham elections. Everyone's going to give them the choice to vote for unity with Russia or time in prison. They want everyone to say, yes, I want to be a Russian citizen. Really, really, really. You notice how many thousands of people are clamoring on the borders to get into Russia. And the message there is don't mess with our ongoing elections. Oh, and by the way, once we win this election and they've declared themselves parts of Ukraine, they are part of our sovereign territory. And if you use any rockets, missiles, or anything to take them back, they're going to be dire consequences. Threat of nuclear weapons. I actually think that in his specifics, when Putin was talking about we have more modern weapons than the West has, he was talking about not nuclear weapons, but these hypersonic missiles that they have. So 2 different basic parts of the argument, and then a lot of intellectual, non-intellectual, pushing hot buttons and using fear factor words, little points that trigger in people's emotional brainstem that they should be afraid, very afraid.
Ekaterina, you've been studying Russian disinformation here with us at Stony Brook and studying Putin's speeches indeed. Did you take this one as a sign of weakness or strength or even panic? I mean, he was supposed to announce it 24 hours earlier and delayed delivering the address.
Well, definitely, I do agree with Jonathan when he says that Putin is pushing some fear buttons, and this was exactly the thing that he has been doing from the very first day. Basically, what he says is that he divides the world in 2 forces, the dark force being the West, and when he says the West, he means the US, and he blames US for everything. For the coup d'etat from 2014, for genocide, for pumping and weaponizing Ukraine. So basically, what he says to Russians is that they have to go and fight in Ukraine, not with Ukrainians, but with Western influence that can and wants to destroy Russia. This is basically his main message that he's pushing from the very day one of the Ukrainian invasion. And this anti-Western rhetoric, we can't even measure. Do Russians believe in it or not? Because there are no truthful polls. And when Putin went with his mobilization idea, it was a sign of weakness because he had said along the way with all his media and all other officials that there will not be a mobilization in Russia because they have enough forces to fight in Ukraine, and that it will not be such a long so-called operation. So now what he did was he prepared this message. Basically, 2 weeks ago at Russian TV channels, on different YouTube channels, or even the same message came from Kadyrov, he's alive, the Chechen leader, that maybe Russia is not offensive enough, that maybe it should be more proactive because Ukrainians started to gain back a little part of their territories. It even wasn't a big win for Ukrainian army.
It was a huge morale booster, though, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And like a lot of experts said that these are dissident voices. Actually, as reality shows today, this was a way to shape the public opinion before starting the mobilization. They were preparing people for it, and they wanted to see what will be their reaction, because even they don't have truthful polls, they don't know how Russians will react to it.
Well, let me
Yeah,
ask you,
and could I
Jonathan.
add one thing, Sarah?
Mhm.
I think that, you know, even when you're dealing with propagandists, you have to recognize that sometimes they are very clever propagandists. And the fact that they waited 24 hours to release this video, we're not exactly sure what day it was shot because we saw a video, not a live presentation. I think someone very clever in the intelligence operation said, hey, the UN General Assembly has Vladimir Zelensky scheduled to speak at the UN. We know the president's going to speak. Putin, you're not there. What can we do? And if you look at the major American newspapers today, Zelensky is not on the front page. Putin's on the front page with Biden.
That's a very, very interesting observation, Jonathan, very perceptive. Let me ask you, though, with regard to what Ekaterina was saying, obviously this war is called a special operation, but can Putin continue to convince people that that's all it is when young men are now being, not even just young men, men all over Russia, including some very distant territories, are being, loaded into buses. We've seen this overnight, and forced to sign up for deployment.
Well, the men who are being loaded into buses are not in the big cities in Russia. They're in more provincial cities. They are, from what I could see of the footage, either people who had been officers or have some very special technical knowledge. There were men coming home in lead coffins out of Afghanistan, which was billed as socialist uh, socialist defense of socialism when they went in there. So the name, most Russians have an idea that this is some kind of warfare. And guess what? Mr. Putin and his big red machine are not winning. And if you think about it, what people are very afraid of is that their father, their brother, their son is going to get called up and sent right to the front line. And I think some of those guys being rounded up today, maybe they're only 5 years out, maybe they know about a special piece of ordnance, are going to go without training right to the front line. There was a wonderful report by Steve Rosenberg on the BBC yesterday, which showed a woman whose husband had been in jail for murder, and she kept going to visit him, and suddenly she went to visit him and he wasn't there, and then she got a phone call from a Ukrainian phone number saying, I'm down here. And you might learn a lot of things about murder and rape in Russian prisons, but I'm not sure that equips you to be fighting and to be cannon fodder. On the other side, you are having up to 10 100,000 Ukrainian troops who are taking time to be trained in Great Britain, and they're coming back with skills. So even if they call up, let's say they call up 300,000 people, and 10% of them turn out to be good, they're not going to have better weapons. They're not going to have a better logistics supply. They're not going to be smarter. They're not going to have broken away from the old traditions of how to fight a war. So it might have to go further. And I think that's pretty scary. Russians are pretty good at reading between the lines. In prose, we call it either Asoptian languages or reading between the lines. In television, I've long called this vectored viewing.
Yeah, but how does that really work like that, Ecaterina? You're from Moldova. There is the Transnistria potential breakaway republic there, which Putin would be quite happy to annex Moldova as part of his vision of a greater Russia. And yet people still sometimes fall for the propaganda amidst all the cynicism, don't they?
Yes, they do. Propaganda is still very present in the region, because if Ukraine had this 8 years to prepare not only its army but its informational space and to secure it, Moldova haven't got that time. We had socialists in power, which were Kremlin people, and we had a lot of Russian media still in place in Moldova, or Russian-baked media from Moldova. So yes, propaganda is trying to expand by all the means possible in the region, but not only in the region. They're trying to expand their influence in Europe, in the US. They try to attract Spanish speakers that are a big part of Europe and of the US. Like this is
US, yes.
the idea that for them, Ukraine, it is a war on ground, but actually they are developing their informational warfare for years. And what they are doing now, they are attacking democracies and West, because they need to destabilize it. They need to press and to push people to undermine their support for the government. And this will lead basically to decrease of funding of the Ukraine. This is what their actual goal is. From another point of view, what was Jonathan saying about the people that are recruited now for the partial mobilization? The problem is that even if those people won't go to trainings, they should have a military background. This was at least what they said. They said that they will mobilize only those people who know how to fight. So basically they maybe are lying and they will mobilize some people that don't have any military experience. But the fact that they will increase their presence twice or even 3 times in Ukraine, it's a big problem for Ukrainians. Even if all those 300,000 won't be the best soldiers, but they will be a lot.
It's a lot of bodies. And Sarah, I think it's important to understand when we hear the word democracy here, it means one thing. But resonating with democracy in Moldova, in Romania, in parts of Ukraine, all over Russia, is not images of Tommy Jefferson or the Statue of Liberty or of fireworks over the mall, but the image of the 1990s, where all the known familiar landmarks of life and culture were disappearing, where the economy became a pit of quicksand, where people did not know where they would have enough money to bury their grandmothers when they died because inflation and reforms backed by an American, Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, ate up all of their savings. So when they hear the word democracy, it's not a, it's a scary thing. It's a
And when
hot
we,
button issue for them.
yeah, and when we listen to Vladimir Putin, we think he sounds paranoid, irrational. You know, why is he playing the victim? You know, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. But Ekaterina, I mean, to your ears, does he sound like he's making a fairly rational calculation at this stage?
Yes, definitely. These are the messages that are very well received in the Eastern Europe, because the main trigger for a lot of Russians is the Nazi thing, and but for Eastern Europeans, for the majority of them, they do believe in Western influence in the region. They do believe in the fact that West tries somehow to drive all these countries on their side. Um, like what Putin is trying to imply is that democracy in all the states, including Ukraine. Ukraine is the best example for him. It isn't the people's choice. It is the elite's choice. You know, even though in the last years, the new generations that have that can travel, and they do travel in Europe, that studied a lot in the West, they want to be a part of the EU, in our case, for example. And this was very well shown on our last elections, when and the president and the majority of parliament were pro-European. So, but yes, still there are a lot of people that believe in Putin. And before the war in Ukraine, Putin was, in Moldova at least, the best viewed politician. He had a 60% rating of approval in Moldova, and he dropped after the invasion to 35, no, to 25, and then he starts raising again. So its propaganda is really efficient.
And Jonathan, are we underestimating Putin's power? You know, we talk about him.
Are we underestimating Putin's power? I think his power is a little bit fragmented, but we should not think that there's going to be a 1991 hardliner coup that's about to sweep him out of power. We don't know about his health, but it's always hard to tell with Mr. Putin just exactly what's going on, because the sources of information, and we do have some who still hear about things in the Kremlin, but Putin's Putin's position and the arrangements of power inside the Kremlin are still pretty muddy waters that we can't see into quite evidently, but we can see lots of things in what he says and what he does. And Putin uses the idea of being slightly unhinged. There's a long tradition of that in Russia and East Europe, but we had it in America. Richard Nixon got pretty far with some of his negotiations in Southeast Asia with the Chinese by appearing to be more than a little unhinged. He's also, depending on what audience you're looking at, persona non grata. Mohammed bin Salman was not at the Queen's funeral, neither was Putin. He was not at the UN, neither was Putin. And sometimes, to be seen as the most extreme has this idea of Grozny, like an Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. People worry about terrible things and about terrible people.
If I may, Putin was also, before starting this mobilization, he was diplomatically humiliated, not only by big powers as UK is, for example, by not being invited to the funeral. But he was left to wait in front of cameras for leaders from India, Turkey, um, Iran, in a summit that he was participating to. Like, plus Erdogan, who was one of his best allies in this war, doesn't support him anymore. He had a very um, open speech, and he said that Ukraine should be returned to Ukraine. Moreover, this shift in the offensive, when Ukrainians gained a little bit of their territory back, it was possible because of the HIMARS that Americans sent, and because of the drones that they received from Erdogan. So he feels that he is left alone in all this thing.
Yeah, even
Yeah,
China,
and
President
Sarah,
Xi.
if I could pick up on that, there are two really interesting points. One, at the recent Shanghai conference in Uzbekistan, Modi quite publicly, the leader of India, who's not my idea of a democratic leader, Mr. Modi really chastised Putin in public. So who knows what he said behind the scenes, and who knows what we've done to push that constellation of power to get India to put its back up against Russia. The other thing that's fascinating is Katrina's exactly right about the HIMARS and that. And I think part of what Putin was saying, his intelligence must be telling him that there are people in the American military and the American Washington establishment who are talking about instituting a doctrine of hot pursuit. In other words, like we pursued Pancho Villa back into Mexico during the Civil War in Mexico and our border skirmishes with Mexico, to pursue the missiles back that, for instance, hit the southern Ukraine nuclear, hit near the southern Ukraine nuclear plant, and then send longer range missiles to go and determine the place that that missile was launched deeper in Russia and wipe it out. And I think that this was his brushback pitch against American discussions about that with the whole territorial integrity. And that territorial integrity is going to be spreading westward after this wonderful, extremely democratic vote. It's a very Soviet kind of procedure, you know? Vote, vote. And I don't even, in Soviet Union, you used to be able to at least mark none of the above. I'm not sure you can mark none of the above in the election that's taking place on Friday.
Ekaterina, if there was hot pursuit into Russia or even into some of these territories that he wants to annex with these sham referenda, do you think that do you agree with Jonathan that the idea that he might go nuclear is overstated?
I hope so.
I mean, your country, Ukraine, you're right on the border there. How worried are people in that region about, using short-range nuclear weapons? We're not talking about intercontinental ballistic ones that can reach us here in New York and Washington.
Yes, the nuclear threat was quite an issue for our country from the right beginning. And when the Zaporozhye was attacked, it was also a big question for our people: how can we defend from it? When in the Zaporozhye region,
nuclear power station.
yes, the nuclear power station, exactly. When in that region people were receiving iodine, our domestic audience was like, okay, and what do we do? So our Ministry of Health also issued a plan what they will do in case that something like this happens. My personal opinion is that yes, this threat is overestimated, at least today. They have this is basically he's playing with fears, with the fear of Europeans, with the fears of the US, and of course of those from Eastern Europe. But Eastern Europe can't do anything in this case. We are just supporting Ukraine and hoping that they will win this war, because otherwise we would be under a very great threat.
And what about?
And it was a real neighborhood kind of thing. If you think the experience is much more alive in East Europe about nuclear radiation, because when Chernobyl exploded, the winds were blowing south from south to northwest. So instead of the radiation coming down heavily in Kiev, it went and it hit Belarus and Minsk and then went on to Sweden where it was detected. If the winds had been blowing northeast to southwest, Kishinev, Moldova, would have been really strongly impacted, and people might not understand winds. They might not understand the half life of nucleoids, but they sure understand that they dodged a big bullet there. And I agree with Katrina. I think it's playing on fear, but I think the real fear that we should have right now is something happening to a nuclear power station and there being some kind of accident, which is why the talk about hot pursuit of a missile that goes, what was it, 700 yards, 7,000 yards, I don't remember, from the southern Ukraine power station. And that's really, really scary. And there's not, you could send 10,000 Americans there in suits to clean up, and that still wouldn't even begin to touch the kind of cleanup that happened.
Well, that is very scary. What about the economic warfare that's being unleashed on Europe? People are very afraid in Britain, in Germany, and in your own country, Ekaterina, astronomical gas prices and economic hardship. Coming out of the COVID period, we're already billions in debt. Can he kind of just wreak such havoc on the Western economies that we'll start to feel like we have to have a peace deal?
Definitely, he will try to exploit these weaknesses, because this is what he has been doing from February. He is stating that all the problems that are economical problems that the EU countries have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. And Putin's inflation, as it is called, has nothing to do with Putin. And this is all about bad policies, short-sighted policies of the European leadership. His main goal in these places in these countries is to put pressure on the leadership. He doesn't care so much how people in Europe will live. What he needs to do is to empower some kind of Orbans everywhere. Yeah, people who are authoritarian, with whom he thinks he can make deals, and basically this is
Hungary,
the economic part of the.
Yeah.
The more he can get the Germans to be worried about freezing this winter, the more he can get the Germans to think that their economy is going to go into significant recession because the lack of gas is going to cripple heavy industry, steelmaking and whatnot, the more he can separate them from the Americans, the more he can prevent the Germans from actually contributing arms. And they have 400 to 600 spare, very good tanks that would be very much welcome. The more he accomplishes his purpose, and delay serves his purpose, the more he can separate Europe from America, the more he can agitate for things like Brexit, the happier camper he is.
But I've got a last question, which is going to bring the whole issue back to the United States, in fact, because we're going to have midterm elections soon. it is possible, things are very sort of 50-50 in the balance at the moment, but it is possible that the Republicans retake Congress, and we could have a Republican president in 2024. And there is some signs that Putin's propaganda is working among the American public with the America First contingent, at least. And do you worry that there might be a move to defund or at least withdraw some of the funds from the war in Ukraine over time from the Republican side? Do you see the American First movement gaining ground? And what if President Trump returns to power? Does Putin think he can buy time and outlast the current, what he would call the current regime in America? I'd like you both to answer that, and that's my last question.
Well, first of all, we still do not know what's behind the bromance between Putin and the orange-haired monster, Mr. Trump, right? We simply don't know. But many of the people, conservative Republicans, especially conservative Republican senators, are old Cold Warriors, and they're as strongly for aiding Ukraine as some liberals. In fact, I would say that aid to Ukraine is more troubled by people on the extreme American left in the Senate, if there is a left in the Senate, than otherwise. Americans don't vote very often on foreign policy unless it's stupid imperialism, like getting into a war in Vietnam.
Ecaterina, you've seen some propaganda tropes being repeated over here in the US. What do you think?
Yes, exactly. This is the problem, Jonathan, that they don't vote considering geopolitics. They are voting taking in account their problems and needs. And when inflation is so high, when you hear from TV that we are struggling, and that the war in Ukraine isn't our war, why should we pay a price, a so high price for it? It is Biden's war. He needs it. You know, this idea that divides Americans based on like their political views. If you are with us, you should think this way. If you are with Democrats, you should think that way. This polarization, it is the best thing Putin can gain from all this thing, because what they don't understand that is that if Putin gains Ukraine, if West, including the US, will not help Ukraine in this war, this means a totally different geopolitical shape of the world in the near future. Because if you give him a little bit, he'll go further. He won't stop.
So I'm going to break my promise and just have a quick one-word answer. Do you think Putin thinks he can still win this thing?
Yes.
I think he thinks he can have a draw.
Thank you so much. It's been fascinating talking to you both. And so it's goodbye, and we'll have another hot topic in future. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.